Hi, everybody. Welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who just learned that Haribo gummy bears are from Germany. Haribo's a German company. Bluntschli. In today's episode, the first half of our two-part chat about Benjamin Barber's McWorld as read through the lens of localism. How's everyone doing out there? Life treating you well? I hope so. Sorry that you didn't hear from us last week. I was slacking off at the beach instead of working on more important things like niche political podcasts. I know, very lazy of me. Anyway, when I'm at the beach, one of my favorite things to do is read. And so I had plenty of time to review the topic of today's show and get ready to discuss it with you all. Before we jump into today's book, a quick reminder about what this Localism book chat series is going to be all about. This is intended to be a presentation from me to you about the content of a book that we think is, for whatever reason, interesting when evaluated through or alongside the ideas of localism. By presentation, I mean I'm going to provide a sort of Cliff's Notes of the book's content and some analysis of that content from a localist perspective. Because this is how the book chats are going to work, they are not, I repeat, not designed to require a listener to have also read the book we're talking about. You're perfectly welcome to read along if you'd like to, but you absolutely are not required to. I'm going to do my best to give you a succinct but thorough treatment of the entire book so that you can easily do nothing other than listen to the episodes and come away with a good understanding of the ideas involved. So as we prepare to launch into our discussion of Barber's McWorld, if you're not the reading type, don't fret. You're still very much a part of the Localism Book Chats Club, and this episode will still be completely enjoyable without having to crack the actual book. With that little preamble, let's get into it. So let's just get something out of the way right at the outset here. The title of today's book technically is not McWorld. It's instead, quote, Jihad versus McWorld. But I'm going to generally refer to the book as just McWorld. And I'm going to refer to the two sides of the conflict that the book describes as McWorld and parochialism, or sometimes McWorld and tribalism. That's not to be politically correct or sensitive or whatever, it's for two reasons. For one, I post these episodes on YouTube and Spotify, and something tells me that repeating that particular word 100 times ain't exactly going to do me much favors when it comes to the algorithm. For another, and a lot of people might disagree with me on this, I don't think jihad is actually a very good descriptor of the side that Barber argues is opposing McWorld in a global struggle. As we'll see, yes, part of McWorld's opponent does indeed include radical Islamic terrorists, but it also includes Catalonian separatists, French cultural purists, Serbian snipers, far-right American nativists, and all manner of separatists and activists and anti-globalists and anti-capitalists and anti-statists and anti-other stuffists. The side also arguably includes localism itself. So referring to McWorld's opposite using a religiously charged term that invokes religious war isn't just inflammatory, it's also inaccurate and distracting. The opposing force to McWorld is far broader and motivated by far more diverse interests than the term jihad would imply. So using that term is distracting, and I'm going to replace it with other words that I think more accurately describe the force that Barber outlines in his book. A quick word about Benjamin R. Barber, the author of McWorld versus J-World. I think I describe old Benny as what you might call a center-left figure, but he sort of defies easy categorization. He's clearly sympathetic to classical liberal ideas, free markets, civil liberties, civil discourse, stuff like that. But he also clearly has a lot of sympathy for small d democracy, even when that democracy contradicts the traditional liberal idea about economics and a lack of trade barriers and a lack of regulation. In fact, he wrote a whole book about democracy called Strong Democracy, Participatory Politics for a New Age, in which he directly criticizes what he calls thin democracy, which is basically small r republicanism that represses the ability of individual citizens to govern themselves. Strong Democracy is a fascinating text that we may do an entire future book chat on, but for now, I mentioned it only to show that Barber is something just a little bit different than the classical liberal archetype. He instead is more than comfortable with governmental action, indeed strong governmental action, if regulation creates some kind of desirable political or public good. The last thing I'll mention about Barber is that he really is an internationalist at heart. This is not a due to his focusing solely on America or any other individual state and treating that state as unique. Instead, he views political and other problems through a global lens and suggests global-scaled solutions to those problems. This might make him and his writing seem like a strange fit for discussion from a localist perspective, as localism is highly, local in its goals and desires, and in fact encourages a retreat from large-scale, top-down political problem-solving. And you're right, it is a strange fit. But I hope to convince you that we localists can still find a lot of value in Barber's writings. Keep those thoughts in mind as we turn to McWorld's content. So now that we've learned about Barber, we can start discussing what his book is actually about. As the title of the book suggests, Tribalism versus McWorld is a book that sketches out two opposing and intersecting forces that Barber argues are currently grappling for the soul of the modern world. His book basically involves sketching out those two forces, analyzing different areas in which their effects can be perceived, and then setting out a solution that he hopes will allow the world to avoid being swallowed up by either of these two sides. Our discussion will follow this same format. I'll start by explaining the two sides at play here, McWorld and parochialism/tribalism. I'll set out examples of how those forces can be felt, but unlike Barber, I'll be focusing largely on American political dynamics, while arguing that the McWorld versus parochialism conflict can be felt all the way down to the national, state, regional, and even local levels. Lastly, I'll take a look at the solutions that Barber proposes, throw a bit of criticism his way concerning why he takes such a globalist slant to ameliorating the McWorld versus tribalism conflict, and ultimately see whether any of the basic principles underlying his proposed solutions can be harmonized with localism. Not all of this is going to be done in one episode. The first episode, that's this one, is mostly going to be about setting out the McWorld versus tribalism conflict and getting into how that conflict can be felt here at home in America. The second episode, that's the one that'll come out after this one, will be dedicated to considering Barber's solutions and seeing whether his ideas are of any value to adherents of localism. Let's begin by defining the two sides in the McWorld versus parochialism conflict. Barber starts by defining what the parochialism side is, so that's where we'll start too. He first points out something important about this tribalistic side, something that actually applies in McWorld too, which is that the impulses it arises from aren't in themselves bad or wrong. The phenomena to which I apply the phrase, J-word, Barber writes, have innocent enough beginnings. Identity politics and multicultural diversity can represent strategies of a free society trying to give expression to its diversity. What ends as tribalism may begin as a simple search for local identity, some set of common personal attributes to hold out against the numbing and neutering uniformities of industrial modernization and the colonizing culture of McWorld. And similarly, tribalism can be, quote, touted in the name of self-determination. Where things go wrong is where this quest towards self-determination and cultural diversity and identity expresses itself as a violent desire towards regression, secession, racism, and the prioritization of an in-group through violence. Says Barber, tribalism is a, quote, rabid response to colonialism and imperialism and their economic children, capitalism and modernity. It is diversity run amok, multiculturalism turned cancerous so that the cells keep dividing long after their division has ceased to serve the healthy corpus. Put more simply, the tribalism side of parochialism versus McWorld is about trying to resist the ever-encroaching force of homogenous globalism, of multinational corporations and international trade deals and free trade zones and uniform commercial reality, by breaking off a piece of some country or state or other political unit and declaring that globalism will not reach it. The way that tribalism accomplishes this is to use some value set present within that little piece, traditionalism, ethnic identity, nostalgia for a political past, religious values, etc., as a bulwark to push back against the sterile creeping of universal markets. To put it even more simply, Barber's tribalism half of the tribal versus McWorld dynamic is the political equivalent of putting up a sign that says no solicitors allowed, get the fuck off my lawn in case you happen to be the right ethnicity or race, religion, political party, or whatever. Or like, okay, you guys know that meme where it's like all the UN dudes saying, come out with your hands up, we have you surrounded, and this disheveled dude with a shotgun is saying something like, I hate NAFTA, or whatever? Yeah, that disheveled dude with the gun is pretty much the embodiment of tribalism. A little deranged, unhappy with being pressed upon by an international and interconnected world, trying to maintain his last little space against the world at any cost. So that's the tribalist side. What the hell then is McWorld, the thing that tribalism is fighting against? McWorld can basically be described in two words: transnational commerce. McWorld is the insistent force of global capital trying to make the world into one big shopping mall. While tribalism tries to erect and hide behind as many new walls of identity or traditional values as possible, McWorld seeks to destroy all walls, all borders, all boundaries altogether, and render the entire globe one unified, unregulated, and highly profitable market. As Barber puts it, quote, every demarcated national economy and every kind of public good is today vulnerable to the inroads of transnational commerce. Markets abhor frontiers, as nature abhors a vacuum. Within their expansive and permeable domains, interests are private, trade is free, currencies are convertible, access to banking is open, contracts are enforceable, and the laws of production and consumption are sovereign, trumping the laws of legislatures and courts. In Europe, Asia, and the Americas, such markets have given birth to a new class of institution. International banks, trade associations, transnational lobbies like OPEC, world news services like CNN and the BBC, and multinational corporations. Institutions that lack distinctive national identities and neither reflect nor respect nationhood as an organizing or regulative principle. Pretty scary stuff. Barber makes clear that he thinks between tribalism and McWorld is undoubtedly the stronger force. To think that indigenization and globalization are entirely co-equal forces that put tribalism and McWorld on equal footing is to vastly underestimate the force of the new planetary markets. Quote, like tribalism, Barber takes pains to note that McWorld can arise from and be based on social goods, stuff like civil liberties, freedom from government overreach, stability, predictability, peace. But McWorld takes these basic principles and cranks them up to 11, trying to destroy government or autonomy or individual agency or anything else inconvenient that gets in the way of free markets and profitability. And McWorld is more than just the literal act of trade itself. It also represents a certain cultural mindset, one that envisions the individual as a certain kind of consumer with certain kinds of political or ethical values, or a certain kind of absence thereof. McWorld is a product of popular culture driven by expansionist commerce, writes Barber. Its template is American, its form style. Its goods are as much images as material, and aesthetic as well as a product line. It is about culture as commodity, apparel as ideology. Its symbols are Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Cadillac motor cars hoisted from the roadways where they once represented a mode of transportation to the marquees of global market cafes like Harley-Davidson's and the Hard Rock, where they become icons of a lifestyle. You don't drive them, you feel their vibes and rock to the images they conjure up from old movies and new celebrities. Music, video, theater, books, and theme parks. The new churches of a commercial civilization in which malls are the public squares and suburbs the neighborless neighborhoods are all constructed as image exports, creating a common world taste around common logos, advertising slogans, stars, songs, brand names, jingles, and trademarks. If you want a less jargony explanation, try this. I'm guessing some of my listeners have spent at least some time in airports. You know how like all airports are basically the same? You get off the plane and you kind of wander around between shops and restaurants and advertisements. When you're in an airport, you could be in LA or Louisiana or Boston or Tokyo or Beijing or Spain or whatever and not really be able to tell. Airports are all so alike in this kind of banal commercialism that when you're in one place, you could be in any of the others. It's just the same kind of neutral commercial global vibe. Now imagine the entire world having that exact same vibe. Imagine the whole world is just one big walk-through shopping mall, such that wherever you are, you're functionally in the same place, surrounded by ads and products and celebrity endorsements. That's McWorld. So it's obvious how these two forces can come into conflict. McWorld presses in, trying to do away with borders and political distinctions and traditional cultures in order to replace them with a globalist, profit-driven, deregulatory outlook. The forces of tribalism balk, breaking away from the internationalist streams to create a political unit that resists universalization by clinging to distinction and identity or darker impulses like racism or other hatreds. McWorld pushes, and parochialism pushes back, though McWorld has more strength and is generally poised to win out. But what makes these two forces so fascinating is that their relationship is so much more than mere opposition. They also rely upon and indeed parasitize one another in order to further their existences. In order to move product, McWorld repackages and repurposes the facets of culture and identity that tribalism uses as a rallying force. Your Bud Light might have a red, white, and blue flag on it to display patriotism around the 4th of July. Heineken might market itself in Europe as a beer made by and for the Dutch. The big-eyed characters in Japanese cartoons might enjoy a Sapporo as part of a marketing campaign. In each of these little pieces of gamesmanship, McWorld is parasitizing national culture and national pride in order to achieve the purely commercial goal of making as much money selling beer as possible. On the flip side, tribalism often survives or propagates solely thanks to extensions of McWorld. The internet, McWorld's great global equalizer and interconnector, also provides a way for otherwise niche political communities to aggregate and organize and act. For those tribalists that turn to violence, McWorld's technological advancements and unrelenting profit motives make deadlier, cheaper, and less detectable forms of warfare or terrorism available to radicals. Think of things like 3D printers and drones, pieces of McWorld that then can be leveraged to resist McWorld through force of arms. And just as the instruments of McWorld can be used to spread the neutered cultural values of consumption and corporatism, so too can they be used to propagate the religious or cultural or political ideas that tribalist leaders require to form a resistant in-group. Think of big corporate media being used to promote nativism, or commercialized platforms like Spotify or iTunes being used to post podcasts that encourage Christian nationalism. This is what makes the tribalism versus McWorld dynamic so interesting to consider and so difficult to untangle. The two sides are both opposed to one another and inextricably entwined. As Barber puts it, the information revolution's instrumentalities are also tribalism's favorite weapons. Hutu or Bosnian Serb identity was less a matter of real historical memory than of media propaganda by a leadership set on liquidating rival clans. In both Rwanda and Bosnia, radio broadcasts whipped listeners into a killing frenzy. Regionalism in pop music has become as trendy as microbrewery beer and narrowcasting cable channels, and for the same reasons. The global culture is what gives the local culture its medium, its audience, and its aspirations. Note that tribalism versus McWorld is definitely not a struggle of good versus evil. Both of these sides suck in their own special way, and if either one of them wins out, then we're all going to suffer as a result. Neither of them prioritize the thing that we and localism care about: individual autonomy, the ability to engage in a civil society where people can act as political individuals with agency, and express that agency through democratic processes that take into account the consent and values of the governed. Barber's goal by writing this book is to find a way by which both McWorld and tribalism can be avoided, to chart out a third path that we can pursue rather than be swallowed up by parochial prejudice or globalist corporatism. Unless we can offer an alternative to the struggle between tribalism and McWorld, says Barber, the epoch on whose threshold we stand, post-communist, post-industrial, post-national, yet sectarian, fearful, and bigoted, is also likely to be terminally undemocratic. But in this episode, we're not going to talk about what Barber thinks is the way to resist the dual forces of McWorld and tribalism. That's what we'll get into in the next episode. For now, we're instead going to take this tribalism versus McWorld dynamic and consider how it might be being expressed right here in America. Who is carrying the banner for each respective side? Where do the various political or other forces in America align? If we're going to try and categorize different parts of American political and cultural life as belonging to either McWorld or parochialism, why don't we start at the top level and kind of work our way down? So take the political parties, Democrat and Republican. Can we slot each one neatly into the category of either supporting McWorld or supporting parochialism? Well, I'm pretty confident the answer is no. Like many other aspects of America, I'd argue that both the Republican and Democratic parties represent their own unique synthesis of tribalistic and McWorld forces, representing both how the two forces conflict as well as how they intersect. Take the Republican Party. Now, on one hand, there's a lot in the Republican ethos that seems to emanate right from McWorld. Big money donors and big business lobbies leaning on the government to deregulate. Lots of big fancy economists from Chicago explaining why BlackRock buying up single-family homes and RealPage using algorithms to include on rent prices is good and efficient, actually. Lowering taxes on the poor suffering billionaires by cutting the social safety net? Oh yeah, that's McWorld talking. But there is a lot in the modern Republican Party that also hews closely to tribalism. The insistence on religion as a bulwark against an undesirable, moralizing, cosmopolitan modernity. The populist anger at the offshoring, one of McWorld's favorite tactics, that hollowed out so many working-class communities, a populist anger that now is extended towards many of McWorld's multinational companies that espouse insincere social justice morality, espouse the values of lefty tribalism, you might say, while continuing to act with profitable ruthlessness. There's the racialized hatred towards immigrants, partially due to economic reasons, yes, but also because they represent different ways of life or cultures than those many in America cling to as a source of stability, while McWorld shifts the world between their feet. I mean, globalist is a deep insult in conservative circles, as is cosmopolitan. That all screams parochialism. It's true that some of the fault lines in the modern conservative party fall exactly along this McWorld versus tribalism line. That's partially because the right is a much more ideologically diverse faction than it's sometimes given credit for, and than it sometimes might seem in the era of Trump Republican dominance. There is a big difference between, say, the generally McWorld-aligned Mitch McConnell and the generally, though not fully, tribalistic-aligned Josh Hawley. The old guard tends more corporate, The New Guard is much more willing to go full throttle on culture war issues and tolerate a distinctly big government, almost at times socialistic economic populism. But it's more interesting how the Republican Party can be marked by the intersection between McWorld and tribalism rather than merely where they conflict. Take the preeminent Republican project, the war in the Middle East. Is that ultimately a war in furtherance of McWorld, to keep the oil flowing and the shareholders happy and the profits high? Or is it a tribalistic war, a war about crushing an enemy of a different race and culture, a kind of modern-day crusade that seeks to establish the supremacy of God, freedom, and the American way? No man better represents the bizarre amalgam of McWorld and tribalism than the Republican leader, the man himself, the boy, Donald Trump. Here's a guy who was solidly of the McWorld set, who is an international businessman who rails against overregulation and overtaxation and too high rates, who then turns around and imposes tariffs while criticizing free trade deals and espousing a kind of nativist ideology that places America both behind a wall from the rest of the world and also alone atop a mountain peak of greatness, unreachable by other nations. The fact that he's able to so fully embody both halves of the McWorld and parochialism duality without damaging contradiction is a testament both to the mixed nature of the Republican identity in these days and how interconnected these apparent opposites actually are. What about our friends in blue, the Democrats? They certainly do often incline towards a kind of tribalism. There's the focus on identity and sexuality as a kind of divider for a desirable in-group and a too normal or too outdated out-group. There's outrage towards what are seen as global capitalistic forces that entrench dynamics like the patriarchy and racism. There's just plain skepticism towards capitalism in general, and a view that people are better served by linking up with local or other alternative avenues of trade, or even just socialism and communism as being better than capitalism. There's the desire, often in response to legitimate oppression, to create exclusive spaces that are limited to individuals or entities with certain shared moral, religious, social, cultural, health, sexual, or racial characteristics. There's the desire to pull away from many of America's actions abroad, whether it be bombing Iran or supporting South American dictators or any other of the interventionist acts that McWorld loves as a means to keep international trade profitable and international waters open. There's also a lot in the modern democratic mindset that slants towards McWorld. There's the desire for respect for the international order, the same international order that furthers McWorld's spread, and the sense that America has a responsibility to act in accordance with that order, even if doing so is harmful to America or its citizens' freedom to act in accordance with traditional American values. There's a sense that government has no place regulating in key areas like marriage and immigration. There is the turn towards free market arguments against Trumpian Republicans, for example. The preeminent argument in this area is that tariffs are bad because the free market provides for cheaper goods, and immigration, legal or otherwise, is desirable because it depresses wages and thus reduces household costs. McWorld loves immigration. The free flow of goods, people, and information without the inconvenience of borders is the McWorld end state. There's the increasingly supply-minded proposals for how to solve the housing crisis, simply build more housing, and in doing so become entangled with about 100 different aspects of international finance and manufacturing. There's the embrace of cosmopolitanism and the idea of global citizenship and global equality. What about those areas of the democratic value set where McWorld and parochialism are kind of entangled? Is support for Ukraine an essentially McWorld endeavor that maintains access to Eastern European markets rather than lose them to Russia? Is it about an international and highly profitable trade in arms? Or is it about halting globalized enemies, Russia and China, who we fear may be infiltrating our home front to threaten our values and our way of life? Is opposition to the war in Gaza about a state actor who has violated the norms of internationally acceptable behavior and could thus provoke future unprofitable instability? Or is it a conflict between two separate tribes, each trying to claim dominance over a piece of land to call their own? Is multiculturalism about creating a society that turns a blind eye to difference and treats all people as essentially similar consumers? Or is it about creating multiple different exclusive spaces where different factions can carefully exercise exclusive dominion without the threat of outside oppression or interference? Just like Republicans, Democrats often find themselves within a halfway muddle of both McWorld and parochialism, though the particular Democrat cocktail of those dual forces is of course very different than the Republican cocktail. Now let's drill down a bit deeper to the state level. Specifically, let's think about the two areas of conflict that I think define state-level politics: the conflict between states and the federal government, and the conflict between rural and urban areas within a state. Is the conflict between state governments and the overarching government essentially a conflict between the encroaching force of international capital, the federal government, and the backwards regressive impulses of a resistant tribalistic core, the state government? That's certainly sometimes how the conflict can play out. Infiltrated by the oil or pharmaceutical or car or tech or whatever lobby, Congress passes some law that preempts state or local laws. The relevant corporations are pleased at the prospect of reduced regulatory boundaries and thus increased profit. State and local citizens, unhappy at what they see as naked coercion from McWorld's multinational forces, resent the intrusion and turn inward to seek avenues of resistance. This is a pretty common story. Or maybe the impetus comes from the state level. Maybe a state starts doing something that arises directly out of tribalism, say, deciding to go rogue and enforce their own immigration policies. Maybe states start stacking shipping containers on the border, or passing their own laws creating state crimes for entering the country illegally and telling state police to arrest anyone they suspect of being an illegal immigrant. Well, the McWorld entities that benefit from cheap immigrant labor lean on the Biden admin to bring down the federal preemption hammer on these state efforts and make them go away. Conflict ensues. But the allegiances can reverse too. Sometimes it's the states on the side of McWorld. Maybe the president enacts widespread protection of tariffs, puts the American tribe first in the face of McWorld's pressure to keep markets open and unrestricted. Maybe McWorld starts to lean on a bunch of liberal state politicians to start talking about how the tariffs are going to hurt state residents by raising prices. And maybe state governors start visiting other countries to discuss, quote, strategic partnerships in trade that sure sound a lot like finding ways to duck tariffs. Maybe a liberal administration passes a rule about increasing labor rights and making it easier for workplaces to unionize. And you start to have states like Florida and Alabama and Texas scream about how this will drive away their business and reduce their state companies' competitiveness in the global market. Okay, now the next level down. Conflicts between state government and local government. You know, kind of the dynamic that localism, at least the reformist version, is all about. Surprise, surprise. Here, too, we see that whether the state or the local government is on the side of McWorld or tribalism heavily varies, depending on the situation and particular issue. Okay, take the rural-urban political divide, arguably the defining issue of interstate politics. Sometimes the dynamic might be what you expect, with the big economic and population center cities projecting McWorld-driven values onto the tribalistic insular rural areas. Take, again, immigration. Maybe state politicians are leaned on by big industries to encourage immigration, legal or otherwise, as a way to secure a cheap labor base. Maybe the presence of new and different state citizens leads rural people, who are more likely to work in industries that could see depressed wages due to an influx of immigrants, to turn their familiar racial and religious prejudices on to try and keep immigrants out of their local communities. Maybe something similar happens when McWorld encourages educational standards or content that creates a well-educated workforce, but clashes with traditional values preserved in rural areas. And sometimes the conflict can flow the other way. A lot of rural areas are built around one industry or one big company that basically provides, directly or indirectly, for the economic livelihood of a lot or even all of the area's residents. In such places, the company usually controls the local government, either outright through corruption or lobbying, or in more subtle ways like playing kingmaker with campaign funding. In such situations, the local government can often become a vehicle for McWorld to resist statewide efforts to do things like raise the minimum wage or implement environmental standards. Obviously, none of these examples are exhaustive. We're barely scratching the surface here in terms of the various ways that the McWorld versus parochialism dynamic can play out across America. I'm not trying to give you every instance where McWorld and tribalism are at odds, and neither is Barber, though he does go into significantly more detail about conflict areas in his book than I have here. The ultimate goal, at least for me, is to give you an approach, a lens through which to view the various tension points playing out in your own community. Next time you read or watch something about a political issue in your area, maybe a social issue, maybe economic, maybe immigration or education or housing or whatever, try to put aside the labels of Democrat and Republican for a little bit. Try to remember the way Barber defines McWorld and tribalism, the forces we spent this episode defining and discussing. And then ask yourself, how can I understand this political problem in my community through this lens? Where are the forces of intruding international deregulatory capital and reactionary defensive prejudice clashing? Where are they intermingling by, say, McWorld using local symbols or associations to market a product or idea? Or when tribalism uses the technology or products of McWorld to create insular communities or harass outsiders or engage in violent resistance? And it's important to keep these dynamics in mind, because until we can accurately track the forces that are producing these intractable and heated conflicts in our communities and indeed our country, we can't begin to think about how to solve those pain points. And we also should learn to keep an eye out for where McWorld and tribalism are lurking because, and this is something Barber emphasizes that I also strongly agree with, we do not want either of these sides to win out. McWorld versus tribalism is not a good guy versus bad guy kind of deal. Though both sides have their roots in things that could be good for us as both Americans and just as people, both sides also aim at ultimate end goals that are entirely catastrophic. Left unaddressed, the conflict between these two forces will end in one of two ways. Either we will end up with an entirely homogeneous world that recognizes no distinction, no individuality, no governments, no boundaries, a hell of unrestricted market forces filled with people who have lost all identity other than that of consumers and have lost all choice other than that of Pepsi versus Coke, which of course is not a real choice at all. Or we will end up in a world of infinite division, a world defined by racial and ethnic and religious and cultural groups who all view each other with hatred and division, a world of never-ending racial and sectarian conflict with no room for tolerance, brotherhood, cooperation, and respect for difference. We have to find a path that avoids these two polar options, a path that tries to take some of the best parts of both sides of this conflict, that emphasizes individual autonomy, agency, and identity, while also recognizing the need to treat each other with respect and tolerance. Just as important, we need to build institutions and political systems that allow this balance of individualism and cooperation to be realized. Barber offers us a vision of what those institutions might look like. And as you might expect, I'm going to make the case that his vision sounds an awfully lot like localism in some places. So tune into the next episode, where we'll conclude our book chat about Barber's McWorld with looking for ways to escape this nasty McWorld versus tribalism conflict that threatens to swallow us all up. If that sounds interesting, be sure to catch the next episode on Spotify or YouTube, and feel free to drop me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist, with a T, pod@gmail.com. Catch you then. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.